let's have some questions, some ideas, some comments, please. And I'll try to stop sharing now.
I just thought of a silly little, what do you call it, tag. We can, I can, if that's how you pronounce ICAN.
You do pronounce it, I can, but yes, I can, you can, we can.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think Tony is going to unmute himself and take care of the Q&A now. But if you have any questions, do put them in the chat or wave your hand and we'll see you.
And also comments, if you've got ideas, share them with us.
What efforts have been made to link with wider range of organisations, well, you've covered that, which may be interested in the issue, environmental organisations? Perhaps you could expand on that a little.
Yeah, is that the only question so far?
There's a question from Tim Devereux.
There's an earlier one. Will President Biden be any better disposed towards TPNW and than the current incumbent? Well, we know he'll be more enthusiastic, I suppose.
Well, I'll answer those two then, while others are doing a bit of thinking. Yeah, yeah, linking with other organisations, absolutely. I mean, ICAN itself has more than 550 partner organisations in 105 countries, I think, last time I looked at the website. And a lot of those are involved in, you know, local stuff, humanitarian stuff. Obviously, Greenpeace is one of the UK partners, as is MedAct, which does a lot of other work and is doing a lot on COVID at the moment as well. And we do a lot of linking with the climate activists, both through things like XR Peace, which is the kind of peace wing of Extinction Rebellion, but generally with, and you know, when we held a youth organization, a youth conference and get together in Paris, ICAN often organizes, and if you saw that slide, you'll see how ICAN has been more successful because we deliberately set out to not just to appeal to young people, but to give young people access to the leadership, you know, to bring them on board as leaders, and also, you know, young people from, you know, Africa and Latin America, you know, and across the board. And if you do that, you then get a whole bunch of other kinds of ideas and other linkages. So last February, just before we all knew about COVID and the whole lockdown stuff, but in Paris, we held a kind of youth training camp almost for 2-3 days. And here in the UK, we enabled several young people who are involved in climate activism to come over. And then other young people came over from SOAS, University in London, and so on. And they took part in those kinds of trainings. And that's really important. And we're interested in trying to get, you know, more direct connections also with trade unionists. So that's something we're really looking at, recognizing that jobs is always an excuse, but that's all it is. It's an excuse for hanging on to nuclear weapons. Far, far, far more jobs have been lost through COVID. And the fact is that particularly at places like Aldermaston and Burfield, actually, there are peace and disarmament and verification jobs that could grow more and definitely be better and more ethical, but it could actually provide more jobs in the local area than Aldermaston and Burfield currently employ with its making nuclear weapons. Then the Biden one. So I hope that so yeah, I've been attending quite a number of meetings, and we do have a couple of steering group members and quite a lot more other groups that are part of ICAN. You know, I think a lot of nuclear disarmament activists, they kind of had to hold their noses in order to vote for Biden. Because even with Kamala Harris, you know, we know about Biden and his approach, and we know, I personally, you know, I know some of the people that were with him working on some of these issues when he was vice president, and I worked with them and went to Washington, met with them, and so on. He's not overnight going to be converted to nuclear disarmament. But we have to keep up that pressure, because the fact is that huge amounts of money go into the US trying to keep up its ridiculous competition with Russia on nuclear modernization. And now they've brought finally China into that. Before that, China was keeping a lid on its modernization programs. But now China is actually sadly joining a kind of race. So, and just the sight of Trump, the knowledge that Trump had the button for 4 years, I think terrified the world, and it terrified Americans, I can tell you. So this situation, and then COVID just reminded everybody, what is our real security about? Why are we concentrating on these weapons of mass annihilation that can never be used without causing mass destruction, instead of having properly prepared? You know, the US, like the UK, actually had identified, I actually went to some of those meetings as well back some years ago, and pandemics were quite high on the agenda, as were forms of bioterrorism and cyber terrorism, as they called it in the US, but basically other kinds of ways that people could wage war. And there was a lot of anxiety about sort of extremists from various religions doing that when the clocks went from 1999 to 2000. And we have to keep vigilant on all of that. But the point is, nuclear weapons are at risk from all of that and cannot stop any of it. So we actually have to get rid of the nuclear weapons and be concentrating, looking at where the next threats are likely to come from and preparing for those, while we are building up our supplies of what we need for human security at all levels, which isn't by and large weapons of any kind. Although, you know, and ICANN doesn't take a stand one way or the other on the issue of pacifism. There are pacifists and there are non-pacifists within ICANN, but it's very much recognized that nuclear weapons are not an asset to anyone. They are a risk and a danger to everyone. And that's the message that we're going to be trying to get across to Biden. We think he will at least recognize that there's a change in the wind. And it's the same with this government. We can't just say, oh, well, we know that Boris, he's gung-ho for nuclear weapons. Well, Boris is gung-ho for a lot of rubbish, and then he changes his mind if the pressure comes on. Did you know that when Boris came into being mayor of London, his aides pulled London out of Mayors for Peace? And when somebody, well, actually, it was the mayor of Hiroshima, in fact, told me directly that they were very upset that London had left Mayors for Peace, because Mayors for Peace, I don't know if you know, but basically it was founded by the mayor of Hiroshima, and the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the key ones. Anyway, so I told a bunch of friends, and we just did some pressure from various different angles through also London Assembly members, Green members, and Progressive Labour and Lib Dems even. And next thing, Boris personally signed Mayors for Peace London back onto Mayors for Peace, because he didn't want to get left out. He didn't want to be, you know, criticised or have a one-page advert coming out saying that he'd withdrawn from this. We didn't let him get away with it. So it's the same with government. We have to make the cost of opposing the treaty higher politically for these political leaders and governments than the cost of signing it. And I think we can do that.
Yeah, thank you. The last question more or less covers what you were talking about. What efforts have been made to link with wider range of organizations which may be interested in, which is what you've been saying. I was wondering about education. You know, the nuclear issue to young people know about the Holocaust, and various things which are rightly highlighted, but I suppose the Holocaust is one of the, which we know Holocaust Day. There's not a day for survivors of nuclear warfare or people who suffer from violence and so forth. Could it be introduced somehow into formal school education?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question, because actually it is in this treaty. There is a clause, one of the paragraphs of the preamble directly refer to education for peace and disarmament. I mentioned it on one of the slides, and there's actually a UN a body that is under the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, which specifically meets periodically, brings together a lot of educational institutions. Kathleen, who I showed you the picture of with the Guinness and Setsuko and my partner, Kathleen has done an enormous amount of work with the UN and also with schools. And there's others who've done stuff with schools, but Kathleen founded Hibakusha Stories, and has been bringing out films. And you know, if you look up on the web Hibakusha Stories, you will see, you know, a lot of her work. She designed with some other teachers. I can remember she used to bring kids. She lives in Brooklyn, and she used to bring kids from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Harlem, from very disadvantaged schools, but bright kids with, you know, really tough and bright questions. She'd bring them into the UN during major conferences and things like that, and I'd be one of the people that she'd have set up who would talk to them about what I was doing and why it matters, and listen to their questions and answer them. Now, we can't all take the school kids to the UN, but we can bring the UN to the schools. And she's been involved in actually writing educational modules for schools to use, and for several different kinds of ages. And again, I think you can probably find those via her website. I think you can find some of them also via the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs website. So that peace and disarmament are used on that. Politically, we've got a really difficult uphill struggle in this country, because we have, you know, governments that actually try to suppress teachers who actually try to talk about nuclear weapons. To accuse those teachers of being you know, left-wing or something like that. So, you know, it's that kind of thing, that there has to be a move. But obviously, if you can get your council to pass a resolution, I actually thought Oxford had. Abingdon, I don't think has. So get your councils to, and then when you've got your local council, go for your Oxfordshire, you know, go for your, or, you know, if you've come up from Berkshire, you know, all these sorts of things. And then that actually gives you, if you've aligned yourself to the treaty, if you said you will support the treaty and support implementation of the treaty, then you've actually got a legal basis for bringing some of these issues into your schools. And, you know, and to do it, and now that schools are much more involved in having, you know, things, by Zoom, you know, there's a lot of resources. There's some lovely stuff involving Setsuko, for example, including a powerful speech she made on the very last day after, it was either just before or just after the treaty was adopted. And she was given a standing ovation. It was really powerful. And some young animators in New York and others basically put her words in her voice. So it was a soundtrack from her giving that speech to an animation that is in its own way actually really very moving, very powerful, about what she was talking about. So there are ways to do that. I'm actually wondering, is the audience, because it's not that big a group here, I can see 25 on. Are there any questions? Because I think you've all been muted.
Sally has asked on the Sally wants to ask a question. Sorry.
Okay, I'll start, but I can see other hands there as well.
Yes, I can't see the hands, I'm afraid.
You talked about deterrence, Rebecca, and that to me is the crucial thing, because it's like the sort of holy cow. And whenever you talk about nuclear weapons, that's what they always say is, oh, but we need them for deterrence. Even though people like Robert Forsyth have just written a book, who was a nuclear Royal Navy commander of a nuclear submarine, saying that he doesn't think deterrence is, you know, at all relevant now. How do we go about breaking that myth, if you like?
Yeah. Let me hear a few more questions, since you said that there was a few
and I could see Annetta's got her hand up.
Right. I can't see.
Annetta from Oxford, are you there? Yes, you are unmuted. I can hear you.
You can hear me, right. If you have a law in a state, in a country, let's say Great Britain, you have to have a law enforcement agency, which is the police. If you have a law internationally, when only 50 states actually say it's their law, and there's no international force to make it work, do you see the parallel? What have we got that would be the equivalent of the police inside a country? That's my question.
Excellent question. Shall I answer those two and then we go on to four, or do you want me to hear from everybody first, or how would you like to run it?
I'm sorry, I can't see who's trying to ask a question. Perhaps Sally can see better.
Yes, Nigel has got his hand up. Do you want to take this one, Rebecca, and then answer those three?
Yeah, sure.
Hello. Yes, I was just wondering, because we're very local to Aldermaston and Burfield, one of the things that could influence our government maybe in moving towards working with the treaty is the fact that there are problems, ongoing problems at Aldermaston and Burfield. I wondered if you could comment on that. And also, there are problems for the Navy in manning submarines, etc. So there are big technical problems. Nuclear Information Services just published a report about all these problems. So I wondered if you could comment on that, because it's very local to us, but I think it's a very practical, down-to-earth thing that might have some influence on how this country works in the next few years. Thank you.
That's great. Right. I'll answer those three now. So the first question was on deterrence, and you referred to it as a myth, and I think you're absolutely right there, Sally. It's a form of voodoo that if they believe, it's an article of faith, but they've wrapped it round with all these strategic, legal, technical, arguments, and people have zillions of PhDs, game theory, they trying to second guess how the other leader would do, and how all of these sorts of things, and all of these things are actually rubbish. That's the problem. It doesn't matter. It's like do you the history of some of the past histories in say Christian religion of, you know, that was incredibly important to certain people, like, you know, transubstantiation or whatever it's called, or how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, you know, or all these kinds of things. You know, people died for disagreeing on those things, but it wasn't factually, there was no evidence, you know, scientists were persecuted for saying that the earth was not the center of the universe, because the assumption was that under God's for Christians, that, you know, where we were, well, of course, there were people who still thought the earth was flat, you know, the notion. So the problem is you can't argue with them on their terms, because you don't convince them on their terms, and you get drawn into their worldview, and you get drawn into the madness that underpins the insanity of nuclear weapons, and you won't persuade them that way. And that was what was wrong with quite a lot of the ways in which the MEBA, some of whom are very, very good-hearted, you know, really caring people who want arms control, and they want it on this minuscule step-by-step process, and they'd be satisfied if only the UK government would say, okay, let us have this replacement, the Dreadnought submarines for Trident for the next 50 years, and we, you know, might be in a position then to move to a smaller, you know, number of warheads, you know, later on down the line. And, you know, and then they'll last for another 50 years and another, you know, because they're caught in this voodoo faith thing. They are terrified that if they did something that left the UK without nuclear weapons, then the sky would fall. Chicken Little or whoever it was. Well, it's not going to fall. The sky's only going to fall if nuclear weapons are used, and then it really will. But it's also, we have to recognize other kind of vested interests. And so it's the, you know, it's the people who profit from it. It's the people with status. The UK, you know, we've massively endangered our security in all kinds of ways just in the last, you know, since you know, well, in the last, you know, half dozen years, by removing ourselves from, you know, the non-nuclear, you know, European networks through the European Union. That doesn't mean we're going to be vulnerable overnight, but we've got a lot fewer tools. We've lost the status that these ridiculous former leaders thought came to them and came to the UK because we had the Union Jack on a bloody nuclear weapon. And Labour needs to see this. The Greens already, you know, were the first to adopt a policy. Actually, Global Greens, I got a resolution through Global Greens back in 2017 that all Green parties are adopted. And so Green parties within other governments are obliged to kind of work for the treaty. But Labour is terrified of, you know, of seeing this as a controversy. And we can't just carry on trying to satisfy that terror. We actually have to say, this is a load of nonsense. The treaty, and the treaty doesn't just have 50. It's the first 50. We're further ahead 2.5 years, or just over 2 years. No, sorry, just over 3 years since we since the UN adopted the treaty. We're further ahead than other treaties have been, and they've mounted up and mounted up and mounted up until they had 160, 170 and so on. So we have to keep working on that. But the deterrence issue is, I think we have to stop talking about, I mean, I think, you know, by all means use my thing, because people laugh, but it's actually calling a cat dog, or the other way around, calling a dog cat doesn't mean that the dog, you know, has the capability to meow. It isn't a cat, it's a dog. Well, a nuclear weapon isn't a deterrent, it's a weapon of mass destruction. And we've got to deal with it on those terms. And we, you know, anyway, so, I mean, there are, I actually, you know, I myself, you know, I wrote during this whole process, I wrote a working paper of the UN, one of the working papers that they used, and I gave a talk in either the 2013 or the 2016 UN open-ended working group that was helping to lead to countries basically saying we're no longer going to put sort of Setsuko, we're no longer going to, I just saw this as Setsuko, somebody put on the chat, we're no longer going to put deterrence, we're just not going to keep talking about it. And so we then turned to Chatham House, that some of you may have heard of. It's a major, very UK institution thing. They've done some great work recently on deterrence. Let them do it and unpick deterrence. We'll carry on reminding people about what the nuclear weapons do and putting the pressure, political and financial and all the other pressures on our government to sign. The second question, Annette's, was about the law. And yes, so this treaty, there are two kinds of treaties that you can do. They're two kind of ways that you can build up the enforcement. Now, because this is actually already a UN treaty, it benefits from all the enforcement mechanisms that the UN has access to. So that's very important, number one. Now, unfortunately, if it goes up to the Security Council, 5 nuclear armed states, and we don't talk about them as nuclear weapon states anymore because, again, we want to put the focus on not just those 5 that have the privilege and status as they see it, leading back to the Second World War, of having permanent seats on the UN and therefore vetoes. We actually call all 9 nuclear armed states. So there's a parallel between Trump and Boris and Kim Jong-un. You know, we take the status away, it's a problem. Like you have to take the status away from kids carrying knives. I did a tragic, I ended up on a jury. Who knew that somebody with, my criminal record from Greenham Common was going to keep being called for juries, but so it is. And it was just an absolutely devastatingly horrible trial that I was on the jury for at the Old Bailey, of young men killing each other with knives, and 2 young men, and we knew that there were far more, but the way lawyers do, it gets the 2 young men in the dock charged with the murder, and their lawyers each claimed the other one was responsible, and fought it in that kind of a way. And it was so miserable because the kids believed that they needed knives. But in fact, the knives just made them more unsafe and more likely to be killed and more likely to kill. It's not a game, and neither are nuclear weapons. So enforcement, yes. So what the treaty does with regard to all of this is in Articles 2 to 5, it shows what the mechanism is. But one of the first things that happens directly after the 22nd of January is all of the states parties, which, as some of you said, it'll probably be more than 50, but it won't be including the UK, have to, within 30 days, give a declaration of all of the anything in their country that has any bearing on this nuclear weapon prohibition treaty. So they would have to declare any nuclear facilities they have. Now, those facilities would almost certainly be under safeguard regime with the International Atomic Energy Agency under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because so far all the states that are states parties are also parties for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there's already a mechanism there that can look at those facilities and say, yeah, okay, that is safeguarded, you can't make a nuclear weapon out of it. And then there can also be other mechanisms through other verification. Now, after that 30 days, the states parties also have a year from the 22nd of January, and we're expecting this to happen at the end of 2021, probably November or December. We're not yet sure because a lot of things we don't really know about with COVID. And we also think it may well be held in Vienna. Austria is very keen. Austria is a state party, and the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty monitoring verification agencies, they are both in Vienna. Now, the first task, or a central task of the meeting of states parties, is going to be to decide on the first steps towards setting up the mechanisms, whether it's an agency or whether the states parties themselves will have a decision-making group to basically to manage implementation of the treaty. Now, this would get a lot easier and get a lot better if we could bring a country like the UK in on board, because then we could benefit from all the knowledge and skills that the UK has in actually taking apart the warheads safely and disposing of the materials as safely as possible, and also the 20 years now of the UK project on warhead dismantlement and nuclear disarmament, which the UK undertook with Norway back in the year 2000, as a result of another initiative that I was very involved with 7 key states called the New Agenda Coalition, which is to adopt a whole plan of action. And that plan of action on nuclear disarmament is still totally, it's a little bit outdated in a couple of ways, but it is essentially still the requirement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, guess what? All but 4 countries in the entire world, so that includes at least 5 of the nuclear armed states, are also members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the UK is. They have agreed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which includes in Article 6 a commitment to negotiate in good faith, and the International Court of Justice said, and let's add a little bit of that in the interpretation, bring to conclusion and implement complete nuclear disarmament. So how come the UK boycotted the multilateral nuclear disarmament? We had heard from Tories for years and years and years, as well as middle of the road Labour, that they're for multilateral disarmament. Yet when the UN does the negotiations, they boycott. So what I'm saying here is that in their wisdom, the treaty negotiators knew they didn't have any country other than South Africa that had actually had nuclear weapons and got rid of them. And those are very special skills, and that some of those skills are not even allowed to be talked about by the non-nuclear countries that have never had nuclear weapons who are part of the NPT. So what they said is, what they will do is they will build an evolutionary implementing regime, and they'll build it through the UN, and it will not be susceptible to being vetoed. And the UN Secretary General will be the final arbiter, not the nuclear armed states. And I think that's really powerful, and that process begins on the 22nd of January. And I'm, personally involved in one of the groups. The International Panel on Fissile Materials has a number of physicists from all over the world who know what all of their countries have. They know the physics of nuclear weapons, the physics of nuclear power. They know the materials, and they are contributing to the work on verification. And I hope to be able to use some of that work, at least in a report that I'll be bringing out as acronym together with CND by the 22nd of January. And then finally here, Nigel's question, which I think, it really brings us to the local area again. So AWE, and you probably know more than I do, Nigel, but, the special measures they were put under, the kind of problems they've had. Now we very recently heard that coming out of the Cabinet Office, so it came from number 10, it didn't come from the Ministry of Defence, as we understand. Unfortunately, I think it actually came from Dominic Cummings, and he's now walked as well. So it might be that the MOD has been celebrating, but what the announcement came up, what was it, 1 week or 2 weeks ago, that said that this privatized consortium, AWE Management Limited, that contains Lockheed Martin, who makes the US massive arms conglomerate that makes the nuclear weapons, makes the missiles of the nuclear weapons. But of course, missiles are part of a nuclear weapon. It isn't just the warhead, it's the delivery vehicle. That the weapon is the combination of those things, plus in fact also the chain of command. That's what this treaty covers, as far as we have interpreted, as far as our lawyers have looked at it. So Lockheed Martin had a casting vote. Again, I'm looking to Nigel to correct me if I'm wrong on this, had 51%. Then there was Jacobs Engineering, and then there was the absolutely shambolic, profiteering Serco, who has run prisons, hospitals, the so-called track and trace, the getting, or aspects of it, the PPE stuff. It takes a huge cut out of everything, and it makes a huge mess out of everything it touches. And by the way, some of the members of the Aldermaston Women's Peace Campaign, who I'm sorry not to see here now, but they actually have shares in Serco, and they raise these issues at every shareholder meeting. But yeah, so we don't really know. But I think that I'm hoping that if not actually on 22nd of January, because that'll depend a bit on energy and things like that, but wouldn't it be great if all of you that are within spitting distance of Aldermaston and Burfield would actually gather there? You know, if you have to be physically distanced, go down in separate. Aldermaston women did this on the 9th of August, commemorating Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with banners that would hold us physically distanced. Put in letters. We put in a letter, but you should now, as local community, raise the issue of the risks, raise the issue of the dangers, be good citizens. And also raise the issue of jobs. If you want to save the jobs there, you get out of making nuclear weapons and into making nuclear disarmament and verification. That's really the message that we have to bring. I don't know if you want to add anything extra to that, Nigel, from your perspective, and with Nukwatch, which obviously works very closely with ICANN.
I think there's a very good ideas on 22nd of January. I'm sure we are close enough to be able to do that, but maybe a group of us could go down there and do that. I have just seen a flash come up on the screen about Saudi Arabia saying they want to develop nuclear weapons. It's just come through. So I don't know what that's about. Maybe we'll have to look for the future, but dreadful news, really. But anyway, we will concentrate on Aldermaston and Burfield because it's very local to us. And thank you for all that thing about the issues. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you for all the work that you do, Nigel. You and Margaret and all of Nukwatch and Nukwatch up in Scotland. David and Jane, and it's really incredibly important that we work together on these, whatever any people can do, but please support the treasures that you have in your own area that go after the convoy, and send us the photographs that I can personally use in reports and on PowerPoints like this. On Saudi Arabia, and maybe we should probably, I can see people looking quite tired now, but on Saudi Arabia, if I can just say, Saudi Arabia has been in the pipeline for making nuclear weapons for quite a while. You know that Israel already has nuclear weapons, although Israelis aren't allowed to talk about it. I've actually talked about it on Israeli radio program, interviewed by an Israeli who is a campaigner and a partner with her group, the Israeli Disarmament Movement, a partner with ICANN, but she's not allowed to talk about it herself. And one of the problems is that, and this is why we had to have this treaty, because the Non-Proliferation Treaty, unfortunately, was a creature of the Cold War and of a time when people actually believed in atoms for peace. Well, with the exception of very tiny reactors that can make medical isotopes and isotopes that can be useful for very specialized things like that and could never be used, and it would be very difficult to make into quantities, that you could ever make a nuclear explosive device with. Frankly, nobody needs to have the use of nuclear energies and the use of the uranium, and never the use of the plutonium that is the raw materials of nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in one of its articles, actually explicitly made it a responsibility of states parties to give assistance to each other. And also it's a responsibility of the International Atomic Energy Agency not only to oversee that nuclear weapons are not being used, to oversee that nuclear weapons are not being produced from nuclear power and reprocessing and all those facilities and nuclear activities that the Non-Proliferation Treaty allows. But the other half of what the IAEA does, and in fact the thing that it spends, I think, probably most time on, and it has a very small budget anyway, is on promoting nuclear energy to new countries. And there's no economic case, there's actually no climate case, but Saudi Arabia, Iran, North Korea previously have very cleverly mobilized that requirement while they were members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then North Korea pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and started testing nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia is in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran is in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but both of them have programs. But so far, Iran always says that it has no intention to make nuclear weapons at all. That is not believed, but that is what they say. But they were negotiating this treaty, and they put on the record with this treaty also that they did not ever want to make or use nuclear weapons, but they haven't yet signed this treaty. They're one of the countries that negotiated and adopted it, but didn't yet sign it. So we have to, but the key thing about this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is that, like the chemical weapons treaty, like the landmines treaty, like the biological treaty, toxin prohibition treaty, ban treaty, like the cluster munitions treaty, it makes no distinction between haves and have-nots. Everybody is prohibited. Everybody. And as I said, the prohibitions only act on the states that sign directly, but through us, as civil society, we can make the prohibitions act indirectly on all those other states that haven't yet signed, and especially if those states, like the UK, are states parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's one of the keys, one of the tools that we do have to use. So we are going to be using that. I haven't seen this news, Nigel. Thank you for sharing it with us. Well, I hope it's not true. I think it's them. Saudi Arabia is posturing, I believe, in advance of Biden coming in, because Trump was a very great friend of Saudi Arabia and Israel, the Israeli government with its nuclear weapons, and indeed of Kim Jong-un, great pals. Biden, not so much. So that is, to go back to the question that did get asked, that is also really a way in which I think we can join forces more closely with the Biden administration, and through those means draw them towards, maybe they'll start by, taking their nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert, for example. That would be a step forward. That's totally consistent with our treaty, but it isn't enough. So we will welcome that, and we will say, what are you going to do next? And that's how we have to be with this country, with the UK, and with NATO. Let's not forget NATO.
Thank you very much. Now, you must be exhausted. Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? I can't see on the screen. Does anybody want to add anything or ask anything? On behalf of everybody, thank you very much for tonight's presentation. It's given us a tremendous amount to think about. Sally is giving a round of applause, so we'll do the same. And thank you for inspiring us so much.
I don't know if you can actually see it, but the Nobel Peace Medal,
Oh, yes.
which as acronym was one of the organizers. Let me just very quickly get that, because I want to share it with you, because I consider this very specially to be not mine, but yours. I mean, ours. Oh, they're people from Salisbury. How wonderful. Well, Salisbury knows, you know, about chemical weapons and, you know, being used. But the fact that sometimes these weapons that we prohibit get used is not a reason for not prohibiting them, not a reason for not putting the resources into the legal enforcement. The fact that, a kid in West London knifes another kid isn't a reason for us to give up implementing the law and trying to take the knives away from the kids in the first place, and working with, frankly, the mums. When I was living in Hackney, it was very much the movement. You know, that's how we do it as civil society too. So here's the Nobel Peace Prize with, I always put it with the Greenham fence and with the treaty that ICANN was collectively given this prize for, because we can only do it together. It's not a prize for one person or even two people, although I was really so happy that we had Setsuko be one of the people, one of the two women that we chose that would actually, you know, receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of all of us, and give the most wonderful speech then too. And then the other person who received it was one of our senior staff from ICANN. And I think it's just really, you know, it's not about prizes. We know the real prize is actually getting the treaty, and it's building peace and security and justice together. But nevertheless, it's sometimes just nice to have something. And it came at a time when we were going to have to cut staff, and the money enabled us, and the publicity enabled us to have a higher profile and keep and in fact grow our staff. And we say to the UK government, cut the nuclear weapons and you'll get more money and more jobs.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Bye. Goodbye.